Welcome everyone to this evening's panel discussion, Ceramics and Geologic Time. My name is Catherine Hall and I'm curator at Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, and I'm your moderator for this evening. Tonight's program is co-presented by the University of Houston School of Art and Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, held in conjunction with Forms of Inheritance, the work of Anna Mayer, which is currently on view at the Craft Center through May 8th. I'm honored to be in the company of tonight's panelists, Anna Mayer, Kahlil Robert Irving, Courtney Leonard, and Dr. Mika Tosca. All three artists draw connections between geologic time and ceramics, pushing the medium to engage with multiple histories as well as uncertain futures. As a scientist who works within the arts, Dr. Tosca provides a unique perspective on the role of the arts as an agent of social change. Thank you, panelists, for your participation. And I also want to thank our IT specialist for this evening, Marcus Cohn. For the first portion of our program, each panelist will present a 10-minute presentation and about their work, and Marcus will drop their bios into the chat as they are presenting for your information. As you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, which we will address in the second portion of our program, where we will have a discussion amongst each of the panelists, reserving the final 15 minutes to answer questions from the audience, selected from the questions submitted. I would now like to turn the screen over to Anna Mayer, who will get us started. Thanks, Anna.
Hi, thank you, Catherine, and thanks to all the panelists, all the other panelists, and thanks to everybody attending. So, I won't be able to talk about everything that's in the show at the Craft Center. I'll just, for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about two projects. I think that'll be enough. But I do want to mention the kind of opening view of the exhibition, which is this photographic mural. It's printed on fabric. And what's depicted here is a refinery fire that happened in Puerto Rico in 2009. Refinery fires happen with some frequency near Houston as well, due to all of the petrochemical facilities that line the Gulf Coast. It's a pretty unregulated industry, and working with extremely volatile chemicals. It was important to me to have this kind of fire visible as a frame for my project Fire Full of Fear, that one of the sculptures is visible here in the vitrine. Fire Full of Fear, I initiated the project in 2008 after I had been living in Southern California for a few years. And basically the project consists of these 12 crumpled slab ceramic sculptures that have text on them. And I put them out into the canyons around Malibu, California. And the idea was that they would stay in the landscape until they were fired by wildfire. This is one of the works before it went out. It says, "There's no need to have a mysterious relationship with power." And, you know, I put the sculptures around Malibu because this is a place that experiences, you know, regular wildfires. It's in the Santa Monica Mountains, but it's a place where there are multi-million-dollar homes that, you know, will burn and then get replaced, and burn and get replaced. And, you know, when I initiated this work, I was thinking about how in Southern California, you know, the idea of land as property and the idea of ownership is something that is celebrated. It's fetishized. I mean, it's celebrated by some, but in actuality, it's kind of this dark cloud for many that hangs over the region because of the difficulties it brings to just find affordable housing. But I also was thinking about, the land artists that left New York in the late 1960s and early 70s, a small group of men who went west and made these large scale works in the landscape. And, for a while, I have been processing the way that this work has, settler colonialist gestures in it, treating the land as if it's empty or as if it's a blank canvas for a genius's vision, but also the way someone like Michael Heitzer is using the tools of the mining industry, of this extractive industry. And this is something that I have been thinking about for a while. As a student several years earlier, I made this work about Smithson's spiral jetty, kind of pointing out the way that it romanticizes, his way of working romanticizes the colonization of this country. So in 2018, 6 of the sculptures, the fireful sculptures, were wildfired in the Woolsey fire that happened at the end of the year. And it was part of a whole grouping of fires, including the Camp Fire, the extremely deadly Camp Fire that happened up north. And so 3 of the sculptures are on view in the Craft Center show. And, in the 10 years between when I initiated the project and then when the Woolsey fire happened, the conversation, the kind of mass public conversation around climate change really shifted. And fires, the wildfires are one of the ways that I think it's registering that global warming is here. The wildfires are more frequent and they're more intense when they do happen. So around the corner from Fire Full of Fear is several examples from my Morning Wear series, which I actually initiated right after the Woolsey fire happened, which I didn't really realize that. That's sort of in hindsight that I realized that at the time, it felt as if the work was in response to the passing of both my parents in 2016. And when that happened, I inherited 2 sets of porcelain dinnerware that we had used as a family on special occasions and for gatherings and things. But I don't really have the same need for that in my life. And so I started breaking down the dinnerware and crushing it down into these really small flecks and dust. And so this is one stage in the process of breaking it down. And I think about it as a kind of accelerated erosion, breaking down this material on its way to the landfill, on its way back into the geologic record. And what I do with the dust and the flecks is I embed them into the surface of these morning wear pieces. And there's a motif in the work that I call funeral fringe, and this is kind of the shape here. And there are lots of details to this work, but the one that I wanted to talk about for the purposes of this conversation is the gleaned clay that I incorporate into some of the work. And what I mean by gleaned clay is clay that has surfaced due to certain human activity or human behavior. So the maize colored kind of stones in this surface it's clay from the desert outside of Los Angeles. There are these mud pots there that belch up clay from probably about 20 or 25 feet below the surface. And they're like little volcanoes. And I had heard about these and suspected that it might be clay that was coming up. But the reason I'm able to visit this site and anyone is able to access it is because the Salton Sea, which is a lake nearby, used to cover those mud pots, but now it has receded over the last several decades so much that it exposed these sites, and it's receding because of the ongoing drought in the region. The other clay that I use, the other gleaned clay that I use here is this red clay, which is from Houston construction sites. And there's a lot of clay right below the topsoil in this part of Texas. But it really gets exposed when somebody's like making a concrete foundation. And so, you know, with this gleaned clay, I'm thinking about, you know, it happens in all cities at this point, just the incessant building with concrete, and how that is contributing to climate change. And so it's important to me that these gleaned clays are kind of surfacing due to these human activities. And in the morning wear, which is just sort of ongoing at this point, I also incorporate synthetic rubber, a petroleum product. So there's this pile here on the right on the floor, and these are disused or dumpstered, the inner tubes from bike tires. And so I make these ceramics that I then kind of bury and incorporate into this pile. And again, I'm thinking about the two lifespans of these materials and kind of comparing them, but also thinking about the work almost like on the way to the landfill. Over here on the right are these two wall works that are almost like wreaths. And again, they use the funeral fringe that's like filling in this like portal shape or tucked into the wreath. There's a detail. And I think I'll leave it at there for now. I think I'm right at time. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, so much for your presentation. Now I'd like to turn the screen over to Kahlil.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I need to get my presentation. Let's see. Oh, share my screen. So it's really interesting being invited to this presentation and talking about some of the topics that are shared around Anna's work. And I'm calling from my home in St. Louis, Missouri. You see the arch, this billboard. This is a photograph from the Illinois side of the Mississippi River. And some of the things that Anna is recalling in land art is also referenced in this large 860-foot tall monument that is designed mid-century by Eero Saarinen that kind of covers the skyline of the city. This, and then my experience walking down the street kind of recalls or affects a certain kind of engagement with material and process in my studio, where I early in 2014, early for me, not too long ago for some, I started slip casting objects in ceramic and then using different technologies like overglaze enamel to then transfer material and color and iconography into ceramic. I was learning about the different applications of ceramic when I was an undergrad, and it was a bit at odds with what the education was versus where I wanted to be or what I wanted to say with the work. And so I started using photographs and digitally collaging iconography then to use as transfers onto the sculpture, but then also thinking about the social, cultural, and political implications of using this information. I recognize that ceramic is mined from the earth to perform specific functions, but making things out of ceramic don't necessarily, or making ceramics as an art practice or engagement or vocation isn't necessarily tied to the industrial applications. So there's a kind of fissure between those two spaces and how material operates. And throughout my work in this time, I was just thinking about it in a specific art context or an object-oriented context. This is a popular mass from 2014. But then taking dives into history and finding moments that are quite complex to deal with. This is a photograph of Malcolm X being carried away on the gurney after his assassination, after giving a or while giving a speech. These things have such effect, and these are moments in time that are being captured on the top of the skin of the earth. And I think for me, my exhibitions and objects wrestle with that reality, thinking about geology and the kind of connotation of that word as like a kind of deep time or a depth in experience or material engagement. And I'm really navigating mentally the conflation and the competition and the complicated nature of that engagement with time. This is an installation photograph of my solo exhibition in New York City in 2017, entitled Streets, Chains, Cocktails. And some of the objects use iconography from newspapers from 2017, illustrating and communicating the murder of Michael Brown by a police officer named Darren Wilson. But then there's an engagement with iconography of European and Asian porcelain production over a course of 400 years, more present in these works as a blue floral motif that is referential to mice and decorative ware from the 19th century. And so if the iconography and the time of my own studio or my own life experience could be implicated in the work, could there be a way to also think about the implication or the reality of trade and commerce and colonialism across time? So the work was made in 2017, but uses image transfers and documents from 2017 or 2014, I'm sorry. And so then a work like this, Black and Blue, RIP, New Layers, No Charges for Wilson or Europe, can comment on the European colonial trajectory of trade and commerce, but also enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade. But along with people who were actually in cargo ships, objects were also being traded and moved and appropriated. And I just thought that it's a really interesting conversation that could be had between the relationship between objects and the history of objects and in their relationship to a trajectory of violence that also occurs through a stem of certain issues and social structures. And so this is another work from 2017. This is one of the works in the exhibition from 2017. This is a photograph of the long gallery of the Zwinger Porcelain Museum in Dresden. Here you see objects that were made in Asia, but also objects that were made in Europe. Ceramic is really made for a commercial or an industrial application. And this is a museum in Germany where they were working to reproduce and appropriate and make their own statement in a white clay. And I think it is in 1710 that the Meissen factory opened, and it also started to produce soft and hard paste porcelain objects. And so in the left, and so I like to really make collages to make time or make relationships between different things. And this is a set of garniture in the top left. In the distance behind some of the screenshots are images of Meissen and Delftware from the Netherlands. A contemporary white nationalist in the bottom left corner, and then an image of how Black men and people's bodies are surveyed or looked over as objects and used as objects. And so that's really the kind of framework for some of the things that I'm working through and thinking about. And so to be invited to work and be a part of this conversation with everyone here this evening. It's just really interesting to think about it also in comparison to how Anna's like thinking about a certain set of time markers or relationship to time that then relates to how the earth or the life materials are formed, that which take a lot of pressure and time. And this is collage in black and blue. And what does it really mean when that earth is excavated? And I'm kind of conflicted with the use of ceramic and if I should even be using it. But that's a more recent conversation that I've been having. And this is a work called City County from 2017. And the last few photographs that I'm going to share kind of all stem around this object. This is a teapot with pewter mounts with a handle, lid, and spout. And it was made in China, but then it was traded or stolen from China to take into Europe. And this was originally made as a jar, but culturally it was misunderstood and not really cared about necessarily, so it was turned into a teapot. But as the wall text states, it says, the thick wall jar is too heavy to make an effective teapot. And so I took that information and started researching other forms that also relate to hobby molds or kitsch molds that I've been amassing that relate to this kind of time of objects through translation from Asia to contemporary life. This is another work where that image of that vessel is embedded. And so it's in some ways making time. Like, what does it mean to also make and embed my own things in time? Thank you.
Thank you, Kahlil. If we could next have Courtney.
You're muted.
All right. Tabutni, thank you for having me. I am Courtney Michelle Leonard from the Shinnecock Nation of Long Island, New York. I'm currently joining you from Dakota Territory in Minnesota, and really honored to be here this evening with all of you. I'll just talk a little bit about my work. It's often, for the past 5 or 7 years, almost 10 years, I guess, I've been exploring English language as an imposed language for our community, and thinking through language deeply in terms of what each definition means, and in particular the word breach. For my relationship to breach, I'm looking at this component of imposition in terms of a nation-to-nation agreement and or the US government and our community. The other aspect is breaching the surface, or kind of a gap in the wall in terms of the components of that definition. And then in relationship to our community as being Shinnecock, which translates to people of the level land or people of the water, it's also in relation to the species of whales that are a part of our community and relation to where we live. And when the whale kind of rises and breaches through the surface of the water. Just to give some context in terms of geology and place, this is Long Island. Our reservations on the east end of Long Island were a federally recognized community as of 2010 after a very long process. And I just share that very briefly in terms of US history in Indigenous relations. All of our treaties were with the Dutch colony of York, so we were state recognized. And with federal recognition being received after about a 40 or 50 year battle, that brings us into a different conversation in relationship to climate issues, relationship to the whale, and a few other things. Long Island is basically a glacier deposit. And I think often about relationship to place and land, especially during this time when our waters are rising. And I think that observing that happening around our community is pretty much what led me into thinking through breach a bit more deeply. So if we were to be hit beyond a hurricane category 5 or 6 level, a good majority of our reservation would be covered by water. So we fit within the conversation of potentially being a climate change refugee community. And so I think often about relation to place, relation to one another, and also whose voice tends to be heard in these conversations. So we're not all one Indigenous community. There's over 565 federally recognized nations in the US alone, and that does not include state recognized communities and or those that are still seeking recognition. So when we talk about climate issues and when we talk about water quality issues and relation to food sovereignty, our community tends to be often one of many that aren't heard in these greater conversations. And so how do you amplify your voice when the land and the water is kind of amplifying its presence for your community and the impact that it can lead to? So the question that I've been thinking through with this work is, can a culture sustain itself when it no longer has access to the material that fashions that? Whether that's the cultural landscape that you live within, the resources that you should have relation to and responsibility to. There's a lot that encompasses that question, and it's a lot of components over the past 10 years or so that have taught me kind of what the answer would be. These images are Hurricane Sandy in terms of what it looked like when it crossed over the inlet. The Hamptons border our reservation, so there's a really huge unequal dichotomy of wealth and then the reservation. So I just share that with you in terms of also why sometimes federal recognition is important for communities. It opens up different climate change grant initiatives that can help support coastal erosion issues financially, bring in infrastructure to offset some of these things. And for our community and our economic relations, we don't have the money and the extreme wealth that the Hamptons do to often dredge sand or bring it in or extend the shoreline. So those are things I think about. And then when I look at images, I do a lot of research into science and aquaculture, marine biology. My brother's a marine biologist. My sister works in Indigenous water policy. This image on the lower left-hand side is that of a coral restoration project made out of rebar. And it's sent with electricity to kind of ask coral reef to grow on it. It's a calcium attraction. And when I look at that image, it reminds me of our summer homes. Our traditional summer homes were kind of this thatched dome shape in relationship to a turtle. And I think about how my great grandmother used to say that every time they would put a new strip mall on Long Island, that they were putting too many things on the island and the island was going to sink. And that kind of has sat with me for quite some time. There, in relationship to the whales, what I have been observing in this kind of call and response, we have this dance in our community. It's a social dance. It's often referred to as a stomp dance, where you have someone who leads the dance and they call out to the community and then the community calls back. And I think that that's probably a way that I observe the geology of place in relationship to land. And one of those observations is that in 2005, a 40-ton, 50-foot finback whale was struck by a shipping boat, and its carcass was washed close to our community on the Dune Road side, which is the Hampton, it's kind of the wealthy side, and then there's Shinnecock Bay, and then there's our reservation. So my bay neighbor is Calvin Klein, but that property used to be owned by the DuPonts. And so looking across that bay water to that extreme wealth, what the town of Southampton did was they spent about $10,000 to cut up the remains of the whale and bury it in a location that we didn't necessarily have access to. So I think a lot about material and accessibility as it relates to culture and stewardship. And this image is of a piece that I created in response to thinking about material accessibility, where often our men who were hired onto Yankee whaling boats would travel all over the world. And a part of being on those tall ships was having access to whatever material was harvested either in the waters or brought on the boat. And that would be often components of the whale that they were harvesting for oil. And this piece is in reflection to having a sperm whale tooth, but having a whole palette of that tooth. And this palette in and of itself marks one whale. There's 49 teeth, which is usually in the lower jaw of a sperm whale. And so I'm in this work thinking about one whale that would feed our community traditionally through winter, but also the shipping palette marks the same vessel that also struck and killed the whale. So there's a lot of exploration that I dive into in terms of import and export. In terms of another component of call and response, and right now is a great time to talk about this. We recently had, or going through for the next couple of days, a supermoon. Sometimes when our tides are getting a bit higher, the predatory fish that are coming up the East Coast as the waters are warming will sometimes herd bunkers or menhaden into specific areas that then enclose after the supermoon recedes and the water kind of goes down. And what happens is that there's a lack of oxygen in that space, but then there's also, combined with the warming of the waters in the spring, an immense amount of nitrogen runoff that either comes from fertilizer and or the density of the population on Long Island in terms of real estate, basically sewage that's going into certain waters. So it causes a lack of oxygen and these mass fish dies. And again, since we don't have a lot of money to help with these situations, the wealthy communities can often have somebody clean up the fish. We have to kind of live for a while with their rotting bodies. And you can use fish for fertilizer, but when you have an immense amount, and that's something I think about with scale, it's not something that is easy as one thinks it would be. And so I created this body of work called Abundance, and it's woven coils of clay, thinking about the material relationship of clay as being, when it's fired to a certain degree and however it's constructed, it could have a notion of fragility that's akin to the environmental fragility that I'm witnessing. And I'll often set these onto contour elevation lines, similar to nautical maps or charting maps in relation to land and water in place. So with that work, it's the ideas that you would want to go to the water to fill your basket, to feed your community, but you can't. And in thinking through Anna's invitation this evening, I thought about this particular work. I've traveled all over the world and in kind of following the path of our men from our community on those boats. And to further have an understanding, if I'm from a coastal community that's not heard in this relationship, then I'm sure there are other people who aren't heard as well. And I need to have a better understanding of relation by actually being and visiting places. I don't necessarily put those calls out myself. I'm often invited to places. And so this particular work was created during a 3-day residency through an invitation from Alan Sillaboy, who's Mi'kmaq up in Nova Scotia. And we had 3 days in Nova Scotia, and it's super damp, and I didn't have the ability to work with clay as a material, but I thought through clay as a component of coiling. And as we were walking through the project area that housed us for the residency, it's called the Deanery. They have a lot of sustainable architecture studies that come out of that area. We had to kind of cut away some of the baby saplings, and that's something that we do at home on our reservation. If you clear the babies, it kind of allows for more healthy tree growth. And so that component of Indigenous knowledge in relationship to an understanding of also fire control and healthy trees is something that I wanted to share, because what I did in relationship to not having access to a material was I then with the help of a few other of the young people there that summer, we bound the saplings and placed them in the salt water and soaked them. And so then the next day, again, that was a moment where the tide came up. I was able to kind of jigger them off of the stones that we had tied them to, and then coil this whale tail moquette that was then placed in the harbor in a relationship of what we see above and below the sight line. And that's something I think about. The call for this work was thinking through the path we share, which was the relationship of the whale as it comes up the coast. And I was thinking about not blocking the sight line of what we see. And I just also just really quickly, I want to be mindful of time. I do think about time as not being a linear component. I think that has to do with how I was raised. And I used to live in Santa Fe for about 10 years or so. I taught at my alma mater, the Institute of American Indian Arts, and I really missed home. I missed the water. I tried to figure out what it meant to be a water person in the desert. And I realized that when you go to the Grand Canyon or you go hiking, that geology of that place used to be an ocean. And so you can go hiking and you can find shark teeth. This particular image was a study by the Smithsonian of a Chilean graveyard of whales when they were building a highway in Chile. And they actually were whales that when the ocean had kind of closed in, they were more in trapped waters, and they also died from toxic algae blooms. And this is an ongoing study that the Smithsonian is looking at. And so thinking about both the clay as a material of time and pressure, and then both the whale as being something that historically would feed our community, and then also within American culture, that imposition of product and harvesting of what happened during the Yankee whaling industry for their oil. And I will probably leave this image up as my last image in consideration of time. My daughter is 10. This is her on the Dene Reservation, helping to bring coal into the home to heat the house for one of the people that had invited us that particular day. And these little dots in terms of density, those are all the oil and gas extractions within the state of New Mexico alone. And there's about 19 different nations, or 19 different Pueblos, Apache, Dene. And so when you think about our essence as a society and the extraction we place on the land and the people that are traditionally within that space, that component of impact is something that I hope people bring awareness to and witness. And I will often use material to kind of reflect upon that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Courtney. I really appreciate your presentation. I'd like to now turn the floor over to Mika.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So as was mentioned in the brief introduction, I'm actually an assistant professor of climate science. I'm a scientist, but I teach at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Chicago. I teach art kids about climate change and about climate science. And as I've explored the intersection between art and science as an instructor, that's bled over into my own practice and my own research. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, and hopefully tie this all together with the very generous invitation from Anna. I wanted to start with this quote from A Parable of the Sower, a novel by Octavia Butler. It's a science fiction novel. Octavia Butler is regarded as an Afrofuturist novelist alongside other folks like N.K. Jemisin, etc. And she really inspires my own work, because as I think about the climate crisis and climate change and the challenges that those present, I'm constantly thinking about the future and how we can together reimagine a better future and build a better world together, much like Octavia Butler and N.K. Jemisin do in their works. And so I wanted to start with this quote to kind of set us on course. And again, it's from Parable of the Sower, and I'll just read it out loud. "The world is full of painful stories. Sometimes it seems as though there aren't any other kind, and yet I found myself thinking how beautiful that glint of water was through the trees." I do think that there is reason for optimism that we together can build a future that works for all of us. And that's kind of what I tackle in my own practice, and I'll explain that in a second. Of course, the reason we're all here, the reason we're all talking, the reason I have a job, the reason that I do this, what I do, is because we are presented with a crisis, the climate crisis, right? Hurricanes are getting stronger, temperatures are rising, glaciers are melting, and the oceans are rising. And I also think we confront another crisis, and that is that humans, while we are fundamentally sort of an animal, a species, we're part of nature, that's just how we are, we seem to have separated ourselves from nature in both our, how we exist in the world and how we build things around us. And I argue that we need to reimagine our future as one where nature and humanity coexist, where we're a part of nature. And in doing so, we need to redefine the boundaries between natural and unnatural. And I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about how I think art and design can get us there. I'm inspired in this effort also by this paragraph from an essay by David George Haskell, an environmentalist and a philosopher, called Notes on Ecological Aesthetics and Ethics. And again, I'll read this. "Once we collectively have an integrated sense of aesthetics, we can begin to discern what is beautiful and what is broken about a place. And from there, I believe we can begin to form an objective or near objective foundation for ethical discernment. Answers emerge from the community of life itself, filtered through human experience and consciousness." Do I feel like we have a role, there's a role for aesthetics in combating the climate crisis? Of course, that's why I'm here, that's why I do what I do. But I really do firmly believe this sort of deep inside in my soul and my brain and my practice. And one of the reasons why, one thing that guides me on that effort is that scientists are just generally not regarded as great communicators. Here's a poll from, I believe, a few years ago by the Pew Research Center, which asked Americans how they see scientists, how they sort of view scientists. And almost 90% of poll respondents said that scientists were intelligent. So that's great for us. But only about 50% said that scientists were good communicators, and approximately equal percentage said that scientists were socially awkward. So there's a gap here. We're viewed as very smart, but we're sort of incapable of communicating our own research. And so this is where I believe that art plays a really important and integral role. And I'm so honored to be in the presence of fantastic artists who seem to be embodying this in their practice. And I'm really excited to be on this panel and have discourse with them after this. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Timothy Morton, a philosopher, wrote a book called Hyperobjects a few years ago. In it, he argues that climate change is an abstracted object, an object that is both too large spatially, temporally. It's difficult for our brains to kind of comprehend what it is, right? How it is, why it is. And so Timothy Morton calls climate change a hyperobject. And while we all encounter abstractions in our work, scientists, of course, encounter abstractions. Artists and designers, I've been working with a designer for several years now in particular, intelligently address abstraction and create objects every day. So I feel like they're very well suited for tackling this really complex and complicated problem. And so in my classes with my students, for their final project, I always ask them to think of an impact of climate change, or if I'm teaching an environmental disasters course, to think of an environmental disaster, to do some scientific research on that disaster or that impact of climate change, and then create an aesthetic representation of it, an artifact, an object. And these are just two examples. I have a plethora of examples that if you're interested, would be happy to send. On the left, we have a screenshot of a global warming Snapchat rant by one of my students, where she went into her Snapchat and kind of talked about climate change. And then on the right is a video of a performative piece that one of my students did, and I'm not going to show the video, but my student, there's an endangered species of bird along the Chicago shoreline, and my student researched, and the bird, of course, is endangered because of both human encroachment of asphalt and buildings and the city itself, and also global warming and the effect on the habitat. And so my student researched what this bird eats and consumes as part of their diet, and then made them a cake and put it out along the Chicago shoreline and filmed it all day. And as subtitles, there are sort of facts and information about the project, the bird, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. So these are some, I think, really cool ways that art and aesthetics can be used to communicate the really complicated problems that are confronting us as they relate to climate change. However, I think that actually there's a much larger role for art and design to play in solving the climate crisis, or in helping us forge a road forward. And that is in the scientific method and the process of scientific knowledge building itself. Here I've compared on the top the design or the art making process, specifically the design process that my collaborator, who's a designer, kind of walked me through. And on the bottom is the scientific method. And I know that the scientific method is not necessarily linear like this, but in general, when you confront a scientific problem or have a scientific question that you'd like to research, you begin with a hypothesis, you move to an experimentation phase, and then you arrive at a conclusion. In the design process, it's quite similar, except that you begin with an understanding phase where you actually talk to human beings, you empathize, you learn, you listen, you understand what the stakes are and what the stakeholders want. And I think in the end, this produces a much more valuable, refined product. And I would argue that if we applied some of this understanding phase and this methodology to the scientific method, we may arrive at a better, more robust production of scientific knowledge itself, especially when it comes to the climate crisis, which is pressing and immediate, and we've got to deal with it right away. When Anna invited me to this talk, she mentioned that one of her pieces was related to wildfire, and so wildfire in this changing world under climate change is increasing across the Western United States, where Anna's project was situated. And I highlight this only because in a past life before I came to SAIC, I actually was a full-time researcher of wildfire at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And wildfires are not increasing just in the Western United States, but really across the world. Here are pictures from the summer of 2019 in Brazil, when the Amazon rainforest was sort of ablaze with man-made, human-started fires. In many cases, actually man-made. And so I wanted to just tie all the pieces together here and say that the project that I worked on with my design collaborator combined sort of my past life with fire and my current life with exploring the intersection of art, design, and science. And basically what we did is we worked with the design team to redesign a website that delivers a really valuable fire data product, namely how high in the atmosphere smoke from these various fires is going. And smoke, once it gets into the atmosphere, can impact lots of things. And so I just show you here, because I don't have a lot of time, but I'm happy to answer questions about this. On the left is the website before, and on the right is the website after we redesigned it with a design team. And so not only does it look better, but it functions better, and it thereby produces much better scientific knowledge. And so I think that this can help us, move forward in the pursuit of solutions to this really pressing crisis. Of course, I always like to end all of my public lectures, which I give quite a few of, with this slide. I try to be a really radical optimist when it comes to climate change. And so I just want to remind you that while it might feel like the end of the world, it's simply the end of this world that kind of we're all participating in, that has the climate crisis and all of these various problems. But we do have a very radical and revolutionary opportunity to make the next world that we build better, brighter, and more equitable. But if we don't first imagine the future that we want, then we're never going to have the future that we deserve. And we must incorporate diverse voices, which includes artists and queer people like myself, to get us to the next world. And so with that, I'll say thank you, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Mika, and to everyone else too for your presentations. I think you've given us a lot to think about here, and I really appreciate your time. You know, I was struck by a number of different things, and we're talking about the geologic record here in part with the understanding that, you know, I think we as individuals are only just a blip on that map. And I think, you know, Kahlil, you said something in your presentation that I think really resonated with me when you were talking about your decal process. You talked about capturing moments on top of the skin of the earth. And I started thinking about that in terms of like the larger context too of our earth and our planet. All this activity that we are engaging in right now, in a sense, on one level is really just skimming the surface. We exist on the surface of the earth. And there's so much complexity and layers beyond our own comprehension, such as that hyper object that you talk about, Mika. I think a lot of ways that I really admire the strategies for connecting with some of these concepts is the ability that each of you are drawing a personal connection to the subject matter and giving us as individuals kind of that time and that space to begin to comprehend how we fit into this picture, how we fit into these stories. But I'm also curious, as we all are moving through time, I wonder, you know, how does your perception, I mean, your work is both personal and archival. Do you find your own perception of your work changing over time? And how does that reflection back to some of your pieces really kind of inform what you're doing now? I know that was a very long, like, explanation, but I'm curious.
And so you're asking me,
Kahlil, if you want to answer that question. I think really anybody can jump in, but Kahlil, I think, you know, it would be great if you wanted to talk or respond to that.
I mean, I think a lot, like all of us are really engaging in like such a like tough terrain that it's like you have to like kind of parse it out and make maps, like some of the design documents that Mika is making, because there's only a certain amount that you can grasp and handle at a time for people to also thoroughly understand the gesture that you're trying to make, either be it through metaphor or through poetry. And it's like, I don't know, it's for me how it's changing is it's just so much, it's so complicated to like either make things out of a material that take up space and take up room, and then that continue to perpetuate the certain excavation or engagement with a certain kind of raping of the physical earth in a certain capacity, or then it's like working in a digital way that then you like continue to feed these farms. Like it's almost inevitable for data farms that are using and absorbing a large amount of energy that then are also existing in spaces that have to be materials and energy have to be pumped to them. So it's like a really tough negotiation. And so it really, I think right now in my work, as things continue to shift and change, there's a certain renegotiation of agency in relationship to action. And then that then manifests in the physicality of how materials then operate or perform.
It's really, sorry can I cut in? Is that okay?
Oh yeah, please, everybody jump in as you have thoughts.
It's really interesting how you brought up like the data, this virtual housing of these data. One of the impeti, I don't know actually what the plural of that word is, but for the work that I did with the designer that kind of got me to this place was that in climate science anyway, we have so much data. We have so much data, and most of it is unused. Actually, we just continue to build satellites, collect data, build towers, collect data. We're just like in the pursuit of scientific knowledge, we're, as you mentioned, kind of destroying the earth, doing all these various things, and then we're not even using the data. And part of that is because they're really inaccessible, even to scientists. And so I think that one of the ways that art and design can improve this process is like by making that stuff more accessible. We already have so much data; we don't need to keep collecting more necessarily. I mean, it's always good to collect more, right? We don't need to necessarily continue to do all these things, which are in many ways, destroying the earth as well, when we already have tons of data. I've been a part of like a number of field campaigns where we've gone and flown aircrafts over fires to collect data from the fire plumes. And I'm like, cool, we're collecting these data, but we're also flying these aircraft which are emitting fossil fuels and doing all these various things. And it's like, to what end and what is the pursuit for? So yeah, sorry, that you just got me thinking of that. And it's really
I mean, but there's a gap in application. It's like it's a gap in application in agency. But it's like I'm like thinking, well, if we wanted to have our own data farm to be able to have in-house our own digital technology, and that we use solar as a way to fuel it or whatever, it's like where is it then being applied? And can it be applied if major corporations have a handle on all the material and all the tech that then also houses it? Like I have a building in St. Louis, and I've been thinking about putting solar on my roof to cut out all of my electrical emissions and not be tied into the local company. But to be tied in or to use solar, you have to be permanently tied into the local grid, and you're going to make more solar, and the company is going to pay you less than what it's valued at, but you won't be emitting much coal usage. So it's like, how do you also combat big companies that then also have a kind of barricade on our life experience? So I think the end of your presentation specifically, Mika, is like one way to engage that, but it also is like kind of like a need of leveling the field. And I don't know if we live in a space where necessarily, I hope that it could happen, but it's really tough.
I was thinking about, I feel like it's kind of related to what you guys are talking about. I was thinking about scale, and Courtney, that was something that you were talking kind of explicitly about, but it seems like scale is something that is part of the conversation right now about a number of different like issues around justice, where it's kind of like, how much can each individual take responsibility for, and then at what point do we start talking about, corporations or the US military or whatever. But anyway, I think there's something in Courtney and Kahlil that in both your work you're both doing something different with scale, but like Kahlil, your pieces with the trash are kind of like the tip of the iceberg or the top of the landfill or something. And then I think, Courtney, I was thinking about the way you use scale differently before your presentation, and now because of your presentation, just when you were talking about the, taking the making the whale teeth, and then those teeth are suggesting like the full whale, like one whale, but then also but also it's like the tip of the import export shipping, the whole shipping industry as well with the palette. So I don't know if I have anything, I don't know if I have a question, but maybe just like do you think, I guess starting with Courtney, like, do you think explicitly about scale when you're working, or how do you think about scale?
I probably think about scale in relationship to microaggressions. There's a lot of times where people don't hear you because they don't see how it's actually like physically present as a mass in your reality, or how it relates to their reality. And so I've grown up with a lot of conversations of like, you know, get over it, or that was a long time ago, or things like that. So I think my counter to scale to bring awareness is to show an abundance of something. And I think that act of abundance is in relationship to how our community and how we as individuals are deeply impacted by this immense scale of relation daily. And I also was thinking about Kahlil and Mika's conversation in terms of data. There is a lot of data. It, however, is not as freely accessible until it's determined who gets to access that data. And it's often because of capitalism. We are in a society run by money. And I have often worked with scientists or been to conferences where data will be held, not in a shared knowledge kind of way, until after it's published. Because the conflict is that in order to seek that grant funding, in order to have that money, you have to reach for those funding resources first. And so I find there is a lot of, I talk about this component of false truth, and I'm very mindful about not using the language of like myself being an environmental artist. I acknowledge what materials I use, what processes I use, but that we're living in anxiety, I mean, in a society and anxiety of false truth. And it has to do with when I ask about scale, when I ask about relation, when I ask about responsibility, I often wonder, can we truly divest? Is there ever going to be a component of going back to zero? And if we could do that, if we could pause rather than produce, then there wouldn't be this hypocrisy that actually exists in the work that we're all doing. It's not that we're not doing it without good intention, but we're doing it already in a system that is falsified and not healthy. And I think that's something that I'm not afraid to talk about, the hypocrisy. So yeah, there's a lot of that in terms of scale.
I think it's, that ability to pause is so important, because I think, the way that much of our culture functions is being thrown forward at lightning speed. And the way that we, especially lately, have been interacting, how we're interacting right now, is in a digital world where, yes, this conversation is going to be recorded, anybody can reference it, but it can easily kind of get buried into the digital scape that we exist in. And who's to say that this conversation couldn't just as easily be erased at some point? And so I know, Anna, you and I kind of touched on this in a conversation when we saw each other or talked to each other last, but I do kind of think about, so much of how we're existing right now is online, and how we engage is through digital culture. And yet so much of this information could easily get wiped away. And I think that, clay has a certain lasting power. Even when it's fragmented and repurposed, there are traces, there are remnants of the past embedded into how it exists. And so I think that this is something that we all, as agents of change are trying to grapple with, what format is the best format to present certain information and be impactful, given, the way that our culture really is trying to push us to interact right now. I think giving a pause is a really, really wonderful thought that I think craft practices really kind of allow ourselves to do, is, through working, maybe not always exactly with our hands, we are having to kind of work at a different speed, which allows for a different way of interacting. So I'm curious, like, as you're thinking through your own practice and the iterative processes that you work through, whether it's with material or data, how are you utilizing that in your work to pause and reflect?
I think I'll jump in. I think that like this ties into the argument that I was making and make a lot with the work that I do, which is that as a scientist, we're not really ever we never really engage with this pause, like you're saying, in the way that I think we should. And I think that art and makers, artists and makers and designers, etc., do a lot of this. There's a lot of intentionality and conversation with other people and stakeholders and interested, parties. And I think that science could probably learn a lot from that. And I also wanted to, touch on this idea that we're just racing forward. And I think that that's capitalism. I mean, that's what capitalism is by definition. It's just like constant growth. And you can't have that without an exploitation of resource, whether it's fossil fuels, human bodies, whatever, right? Like, so this is by design. I think this like, not a design that I like, but this is the design of capitalism, which is that we just constantly are growing, moving on to the next thing, discarding the old, in with the new. Get a new iPhone 12, discard your old iPhone 12. The irony, of course, is that we're talking about geologic time. All of those discarded iPhones, all of those discarded, computers that hold this conversation, for example, actually will be there in the rock for a really long time, which is why we call this era the Anthropocene, right? Like, we'll be able to see it in the rock. We just won't be able to see necessarily what was on it. So it's really this interesting dichotomy that I think about a lot, and that, it's like when we find an old, and of course I'm not an artist or a ceramic person, so correct me if I'm wrong, but when we find pots and other things from histories before preceding us, we can talk about that, we can think about that. When we find like a discarded iPhone, I don't know, we have no idea. There's a bajillion of them, and we have no idea what was on that. We have no idea what it was used for, and we can't even really guess. And so it's the kind of, I don't know if irony is the right word, of our time, that we're accumulating all of this stuff, but it's unusable, like you were saying, Catherine.
I was thinking about when you shared, Anna, when you shared your photographs, and you had the inner tubes or the petroleum covered material. In India, they use tires as fuel to fire ceramic, and it's like a kind of black, like it's a black surfaced ware. And
wow.
I was on a residency, and a woman came and she talked about she did a Fulbright there and talked about this process. And I think, they did it out of a certain kind of survival. They had to make the things to produce something, to perform a role in society. And I think since moving home full time from New York City and like being here more stable, I've like gotten to a point, just to answer your question, Catherine, is like a certain kind of, I'm working towards a kind of space to be content. And I think this consumption, this hyper consumption that is led by this expectation of infinite economic growth, is the lack of to be station, or however you say it, to be satisfied. And I'm like, I've gotten to a point where I'm wanting to be more and more satisfied, where it doesn't necessarily lend me to, where then it takes the work also takes longer to make. There's like things that are arrived at a different pace. The warehouse that I bought for my studio has a half an acre of land behind it. So like, can that land be cultivated to where there's some kind of sustainability through it that can yield a longer term existence and rejuvenate it back to something that's functional and not just something that has a history of lead-based pipes and things like that embedded in it, but that can be excavated and it can be returned back to something that can continue to breathe and live in a certain capacity. But I don't, in the large like dimension of everything, it's really hard to think of my individual self could really have that much of an impact in a machine that is moving at such a pace and such a scale. One last thing real quick. A friend of mine was reading an article and she was telling me how in the article they were talking about moving the capital from DC to St. Louis as a way to restabilize the coasts and have a central point that also protects the capital. And I was like, it's so unrealistic that they would pack up the Capitol buildings and drive them all to the Midwest. But then I think about where we live in the United States, and the United States is all about that kind of performance and excess. And they could very well decide tomorrow, in 3 years, we are deconstructing DC in the capacity at which it stands today for all of the government, and we will be relocating. And so it's like, you know, how do you live in the face of a machine that is just so grand and that there's no way to really stop it? And then I was listening to NPR today and they were talking about international police. How do we call the international police on things that aren't, you know, that are happening that we don't have control over? Who are protecting the people who don't have any control or aren't sitting in positions that can truly affect, like the Army or the National Guard and such? So it's like, those are a little bit of a few things that I've been thinking about in relationship to your question.
I think just listening to Kahlil, one of the things that I think about is how we teach or how we don't teach, and how teaching is funded in the US. If you look at rural areas and where these conversations or education systems may not exist, it's usually in communities that are reliant on the extraction of that community. And they often are not taught these discussions so that they therefore cannot be anti-system. And then in thinking about false truth in the capital, DC is built on wetlands. So it's not actually land that is meant to hold that space. And that's another thing that I think about is, like, there was a question in one of the chats, is this idea of as artists in this art world, like, how do we engage with capitalism? And coming from the Hamptons, there's different phrases like keeping up with the Joneses. And I think a part of like Kahlil, the experience of our lives are not ones that we have choices. And when you don't have a choice when the water is rising, then you have to kind of find a way to figure out who's going to listen to you, like, and who's going to like bear witness with you that this needs to be called to attention. And then if you have no other way out in terms of living as yourself with this imposition, like, we can't, because of our infringement of our territory, we have a reservation. We can't go anywhere else legally. We can't call the international police, you know, and in that regard, what do you do? And I've always kind of approached Breach as this kind of like holding on to the scraps on the table of what we have left. And I started to think about certain relationships to land and geology and wealth. Dubai is a built island. And I remember being at a panel discussion at MIT where this urban landscape designer talked about their work in Manhattan. and they ended their lecture with, "It's so easy to build an island." And here I was about to go into a lecture about losing land. And so I think that idea of teaching and education is one that maybe we could have a holistic approach to responsibility to place and relation, full of more truths than were offered within what we're taught in public schools. And in that regard, giving that empowerment to these next generations affords more collaborative discussion that hopefully won't be withheld by who's trying to apply for the grant, you know? So like, that's the thing that gets me is if we're in this together to actually assist in a future, then why at some point do we silence so that we're not truly sharing with one another? And I think that's the thing that we have to kind of remind ourselves, is that that notion of competition, of staying above water, is something that we have to kind of resist in order to kind of collectively address the issues that we're like maybe talking about, but sometimes I don't even know if that is what I'm doing, because I'm fixed in this position of like, I have no choice.
Yeah, it's tough.
And I think, you know, capitalism teaches us this idea, we talk about like survival of the fittest, but really like in nature, I think it's a lot more collective, and how each individual organism is really kind of influencing the spaces that it exists in, it breathes in. And I think you're exactly right, Courtney. I mean, getting us to think less about this competitive environment and more about kind of, that's where I think like gives me a little bit of hope to think about, you know, yes, the time that we spend on this earth is just a blip on the map, but also like if we have the ability to empower other individuals to think for themselves, to do for themselves, and to work collaboratively, you know, it builds that kind of, you know, ethical discernment to what you were talking about, Mika, hopefully, like with this collective aesthetic. And that's where I feel like the role that you all have is so impactful, because, you know, so much money is spent on collecting and storing art. And, you know, I think about with the climate crisis, there's just more and more like systems that are designed to safeguard work. But why does any of that matter if we're not looking at the bigger picture? We're only looking at that piece of art that we or different individuals claim ownership over. Is there a different way that we can be thinking about safeguarding what we have about the world that we live in, as opposed to just the material objects that we live with?
The Fire Full of Fear has been like this really important work for me. I mean, in part because it feels like strange to be sitting here in 2021 talking about a work that I initiated in 2008, or basically made in 2008. And that's, you know, in terms of like a capitalist art market or whatever, that's like not really what you're supposed to do in you know, and I mean, that's how I'm trained. Like, I'm usually interested in the next thing that I want to do, the new idea that I have or whatever, but having to kind of sit with that work over time. I mean, I guess I'm thinking about this in terms of the pause, but also the idea of artistic production being a part of this system of like hoarding. It's been interesting to have this work that I have to keep returning to every year, basically, but also that was so much about a conceptual gesture. And then there is this really like, there is obviously an object now that's visible. But anyway, I think when I was thinking about presenting on it today, I was thinking that it's just so old. But it actually has really shifted the way that I experience time and experience my practice. Not always looking forward, but having something that I really have to keep looking back at.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to ask you about that. I had some comments on that too with regards to the pause and all of that. But I think specifically I saw an article that was like, or maybe you sent it to me, that was like, the headline was, artist Anna Meyer predicted that wildfires would ravage Malibu. And I was like, I don't know if that's something that someone could predict. Like, of course it's going to happen. In 2 decades, there will be a wildfire in Malibu. And it's kind of almost sad, but also an important reflection that we just know that that's going to happen. Like, you didn't have any premonitions or you weren't provided any like advanced data. You just assumed that there would be a fire, and that speaks to this like slow rolling of or fast rolling really of like this capitalist world and climate change as it fits into that, and that it's inevitable. And this inevitability and the inevitability of these pots being fired by fires, literal fires, almost makes me sad in a way. Like, it's a sad reflection that we just knew that that would happen in this way. And so I don't know if I have anything really to say about it, but I just love hearing your thoughts on that work in particular. One, because it is so sort of old, but it's also like very new, right? Weren't they just kind of recently fired? Like it was 10 years later that they were actually, the wildfire came through. So it's like, I don't know. It's an interesting like reflection on pause, but also like the movement of time forward and the inevitability of these crises.
How do you mark those pieces? How do you know where they were 10 years later? How did you know that they were even there? Do you like geocache them or something?
Yeah, I mean, at the time I rented like a GPS, device for hikers or whatever, but it worked.
Geocache your own art.
Yeah. But I mean, part of, I think, what was like, I guess the story I would tell is that, I did need those locations because the landscape had changed so much because it was so devastated by the fire, or it was so altered by the fire. But before that, all of the pieces had been buried basically because the ground covering had grown up and died and stayed in place above the pieces. And I mean, that is also this real lesson to me, given the way that I was raised and not raised in the natural world, where it really surprised me how much the landscape changed over several years. Like, and I think that's testament to how human-centered, my perspective is, but I would say a lot of people's perspectives are that you sort of can't believe actually how much things will grow and change in time. Yeah.
I was just thinking about the idea of going back to a work that was created however many years ago as being relevant to today within like the art world. I think that there's a lot of freedom to thinking through those questions when somebody says, how long did it take you to make this? And apply that to the idea of relation and kind of, I was thinking about relationality in physics and like the theory of relativity and those kind of components as it relates to kind of ideas of indigenous knowledge. And so when you are in the act of responding in relation to your lived experience, it shouldn't be determined in a fixed position. And if it is determined in a fixed position, there's truly no growth within that work, because it's often not reflective upon really observing and relating to observation. And it's more kind of fitting the need that somebody else is predetermining of what the expectation should be. And so if we already know, like I talk sometimes about color theory and product design as being when you go to the store and you get a Babe Ruth or an Almond Joy, you're expecting some almonds and some joy in that packaging. And so you already have this predetermined idea of what you're supposed to consume. But what happens if it's not inside there? What happens to alter the mind and the way that we relate to that experience of taste and our senses when we actually have to observe before we have a preconceived notion of what to expect? And I think that idea is really truly what is communication. And I think going to Mika's discussion about where science and art and aesthetics can relate in order to kind of broaden our horizons as lived people is thinking through not knowing what the answers are going to be, but knowing what the possibilities could be. So I appreciate not, and I'm stubborn as hell, so I appreciate people not telling you what to make, because then I'm like, I feel kind of numbed at that personally. Yeah.
Bring a lot of good points up. I want to be mindful of our time. We're getting close to 8 o'clock. I know we kind of addressed some of the questions that Carol dropped into the chat. We don't currently have any specific questions in the Q&A box, but I just wanted to verbally invite people if they want to submit in the Q&A to please feel free to do so. And Kahlil, you had something that you wanted to?
So a few of them were put in the chat. There was one that communicates around how we each engage with the art world capitalism, and how do we decide where and to whom you allow your work to be collected and exhibited? And do you consider how the spaces are funded and or who's on the boards? That means you have to have access to even know the information in the first place. I mean, you may be able to figure out their names, because in museums, they keep the names on the walls on the outside of near the entry of the building, but those people also change depending on the board nomination and turnover. I don't know. I'm not here to debate morality. That's kind of a question about morality, and I'm not here to kind of place a hierarchy within the relationship of moral situations, because in which we do live in this situation, we do have to survive, we do have to live, we do have to work. And I think if you have the opportunity to get some funds and have some money, it's not necessarily just where the money comes from, but it's also in comparison what you do with the funds as well. And so in some ways, working towards a certain kind of stability and being content here at home, I took all my grant money. I've taken half a year's of sales, and I spent $100,000 on a warehouse that's 13,000 square feet, and it's in a little island on my own. And if I continue to pay my mortgage and pay that mortgage off, it's an island on my own for a long, long time. And so in that content, in that, the problematics of however somebody else operates, and it's also, I'm not here to compare or contrast either. What they do to get their money is one thing. We know how they got their money. You don't get rich and big and famous without putting your hand on somebody's, around someone's throat. It's very hard to get like that without exploitation. So it's what can you do to survive? I just also think the people who do work for the federal government and federal contractors get paid $10.50 an hour. It's how many years have they been living damn near close or below the poverty line? How many people work jobs in this country at or below or extremely beyond the poverty line? And people don't really care, but then we have such a care about how artists get money. It's artists also are living so, on the fringe of the poverty line. It's like somebody can give you a couple bucks. It's like, if they're, if it's in the news, it's one thing, but if it's like, I don't know, I think it's like a dilemma or a situation that each person has to contend with on their own and there has to be no room for judgment either, because we're all trying to, unless, you're in that position, they're all trying to survive.
Yeah, it reminds me of that cartoon or something where they're like critiquing, some guy is like critiquing, I don't even remember what it was, like iPhones, and they're like, but you're doing it on your iPhone. And he's like, yeah, well, I live in the world in capitalism. Like, I still have to operate within the.
And I've had my iPhone for almost 6 years, so it's like, I ain't getting no iPhone no time soon. It like tells me all the time, you need to update, you need this, your phone is full. It's like too damn bad. I ain't doing anything to it. Fuck it. It is what it is.
Matt Bors. Okay, yeah. So someone knew it. Okay, I love that. Also, Courtney, I totally wrote down that quote that you just said. It's about not knowing the answer will be, but knowing what the possibilities can be. And I'm definitely gonna use that and quote you. So it's really nice. I like it. It's perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, I just I was. So I'm not trying to like plug a show, but there's this new show called Rutherford Falls. That's on Peacock, and it's made by an like Indigenous director, Indigenous cast. It talked a bit about capitalism as it relates to casinos and kind of the idea that Indigenous communities should not have casinos because that's not Indigenous. It speaks more to the idea of who we are as a society and as Indigenous people, that we have deeply ingrained historical complex societies of trade, of relation within communities. So it digs a little bit deeper in a teachable way. And I was thinking about Kahlil in terms of like knowing who the board is, aside from the name of the place that you walk into in the gallery. I do Google, like it's on the websites of a lot of these places. So I do kind of Google sometimes who I'm working with. I don't necessarily predetermine how much I'm going to do with that information because I'm trying to amplify like, can you hear us, kind of that idea. And in that regard, I do question if this idea of like the white box space is something that's worthy of me even asking for them to be aware of who I am or who we are as a people. But I'm interested more in like applied science. I also would like to own my own home. I do not. So I think that a lot of capitalism for myself is paying back student debt and loans because I thought that I needed to be educated within the system to also be heard. So there's a lot of things that I've learned along the way that is a part of this, the thing that I gave too much power to. And I think that it's interesting because there are artists who will choose after they're already in a show to then battle the board or the conflict of the space that supported them to be in that exhibition. And I think that to a certain degree, it's great that that work is done, but it also, controversy is a way to also amplify artists. And there's kind of like a game that's played a little bit as to when an artist, do you do that before you get into the show and before you get your stuff sold? Or do you do that after so that your name is further amplified? So I think really just like when I talked about observation in science, there's also observation in capitalism. And I don't think that any of us are avoid of the system that we're working within. I sometimes question why I continue to give it power. And that's just something for for myself that I try to like, I'm my own worst critic. So I'm trying to kind of just think about my place in the time that we have of what I'd like to do next or where I want to give the power to. But it's all messed up. And I just wish we talked about it more as if we're not actually doing it. So we're all doing it. And the cell phone thing, my husband always laughs at me when I give my talks about so Indigenous people are not supposedly by people who follow PETA and Sea Shepherd and want to give money to organizations that are anti-whaling. They don't really know the structure of stewardship in relationship to feeding yourself locally. And so they will attack Indigenous communities who still continue to harvest whales. If people are truly concerned about the life of a whale, they should know that the majority of whales killed per year are struck by our shipping boats. So usually when I'm with an audience, I'll ask, how many of you have a cell phone? And you all killed a whale. So in that regard, a lot of people are kind of not thinking about their own personal responsibility to import and export and impact, and are very quick to, like you said, Kahlil, judge someone else in the relationship to this because they think that you should be this authenticness that they are perceiving, you know? So I just wish people would check themselves first before they want to insert that on others. Yeah.
Another part about the museum situation too is like you can participate in an exhibition or have an exhibition, but then you can also use it as a space to also implicate the space, which a lot of people don't necessarily do, which I've been finding quite interesting as a way of working. And I've been wrapping some spaces that my work is installed in wallpapers that are removable, like stickers, and I can add things into them or not, you know, I can use them again later as a way to then also make commentary about location. And there was something else that I wanted to share, but I can't remember. I just like, it just flew right out of my head, but I'll just be quiet.
Well, does anybody else have any final reflections that you'd like to share? I know we're a few minutes over 8. I feel like there's so much that we could talk about, and I would love to keep the conversation going. But I want to be mindful of everyone's time.
I wish I could come to Houston to see the show, you know, to see the work and to, you know, be in presence with the space and to be able to kind of see, you know, this decade of labor, the Earth's labor and your labor coming together and manifesting and creating the conversation that we're able to have today together.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for being here. I really appreciate all your work so much. And it's great to be able to be together in this way. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. Thank you so much for the invitation. And it's always humbling to be in the presence of such brilliance and such like insight. So thank you guys so much. I always feel really honored as a scientist to be invited into art spaces. It's really fun for me.
I was teaching today and one of my students, my graduate TA, actually I was sharing, and he was like, oh, I need to talk to her. I was like, you know, well, sometimes nothing but a phone call or email away. You just never know who will answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to say thank you also and just acknowledge that your invitation for all of us is kind of an example of collective thinking and conversation and collaboration that we're doing a bit more of that lately, but the idea that you opened up space that could have just been reserved for yourself in conversation and the amplification of your personal work, I just wanted to acknowledge that my appreciation for this space and learning of Mika and spending time with Kahlil. It's through those acts that I think to center kind of positivity with the end of Mika's presentation is to just acknowledge that as well. So Tabuni, thank you.
Thank you.
So nice to meet you, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It's been such a pleasure. And I hope at some point we'll be able to be in a physical space together. But really, I just want to say a big thank you to you all and the work that you're doing. I think it's incredibly important. And Anna, thank you again so much for giving us the opportunity to gather together to have this conversation. Thanks everybody for participating and tuning in tonight, and look forward to seeing you all in the future. Good night, everybody.